Being trans, as a result of this ruling, does not legally give you the right to be treated as a woman who was born biologically female is in all circumstances. Rather than this being a moment of clarity and a moment of closure, it is used as a moment where we basically say, and the people who are basically hostile to trans rights basically say, look, the court said, you're not really a woman. You're not really a man.
But it's also been seized on by the populist right, and they are now kind of claiming a huge victory on this today.
But I guess the question is, what then does the gender certificate mean?
Exactly.
In the case of the Equality Act, the 2010 Equality Act, when it refers to woman or sex, it is referring to biological sex.
A woman is somebody that can have a baby under certain circumstances.
The Labour Party leader can't actually define a woman, as we can't actually rule him out from running to be Labour's first female Prime Minister.
The overwhelming majority of women, it's a biological issue.
I mean, Keir Starmer can't tell you what a working person is or what a woman is.
And so what is your definition of a woman?
As I said, I would exactly agree with what the Prime Minister said.
An adult human female?
A woman can have a penis.
I don't think we can conduct this debate with,
Sorry, have I offended you in something?
No, it's just...
Can a woman have a penis? No.
Trans people are less than 1% of the population, right? And you'd be forgiven for thinking that we're responsible for all of the world's ills.
Police are assessing this video of Lawrence Fox burning pride flags.
Can you provide a definition for the word woman? Yeah.
I can't.
Now she wants to do transgender operations on illegal aliens that are in prison.
Some on the right have truly lost their minds about trans rights.
I'm Ted Cruz, and my pronoun is kiss my ass.
So guess what we're talking about today? That's right. It is, I guess you'd call it a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court that has tried finally to provide some clarity to that question that none of our politicians have for a long time been able to answer very well. What is a woman?
And maybe mercifully, that debate, which in reality affects very few people, but has taken up an inordinate amount of oxygen, will be done. But there are still many questions that arise out of today's Supreme Court judgment, which we're going to try and unpick right now. Welcome to the News Agents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And Lewis, I know you drew the short straw this morning
about I love a court ruling.
Who would be the person who would go through the absolute detail of the case and pick out its most important points. And Lewis, that falls to you.
Indeed. Look, this is, as Emily said at the start, this is a landmark ruling. It's one of those Supreme Court cases which is going to reverberate, not just in terms of the narrow legal question it was being asked to decide, but more socially. In terms of that narrow legal question, basically the Supreme Court was being asked a question. When the Equality Act, which was introduced by the Gordon Brown government, basically the last act that Labour government passed back in 2010, which protects people on the basis of their characteristics like sexuality, race, gender or sex. When it talks about sex in that legislation, does it mean biological sex, i.e. the sex you were born with? Or can it include someone who has legally changed their gender with a gender recognition certificate, i.e. a trans woman or trans man? And this all came about because of actually quite a kind of obscure law, which was passed by the Scottish government back in 2018, which had the aim, quite noble aim, of trying to get more women onto public boards. But as part of that legislation, it counted trans women with legal recognition as women as part of that legislation. And a women's campaign group in Scotland said, hold on a minute, that goes against the Equality Act, which protects women, us, i.e. women who were born female, and took it to court. The argument was it was unfair that trans women were treated as women for these purposes because it contravened their rights. So the court had to decide, what did Parliament mean in 2010 when it passed the Equality Act? And today the court ruled that they meant that sex means biological sex. Basically, the court is saying, if you weren't born female, you do not count as a woman under the Equality Act. Why? Because the law includes lots of specific protections and exceptions based on whether someone is male or female at birth. Things like women's only spaces, job quotas, or protection from sex-based discrimination. They said that that act only makes legal sense if women Woman means someone born female.
Yeah, and about 10 o'clock today, this judgment was handed down by Lord Hodge, who's what they call the Deputy President of the Supreme Court. And he set out very clearly that it wasn't the task of the court to actually make policy to decide how these groups should be protected. All they were doing in the rule was to ascertain the meaning of the legislation that Parliament had enacted. In other words, he was saying it is a parliamentary fudge. It's, he didn't say this, it's a up, but it is an overlap of two bits of legislation that they've had to make sense of. And it was a unanimous decision. So it was a unanimous decision by the court that the terms women and sex in the Equality Act that Lewis was referring to, 2010, refer to a biological woman and biological sex. And then he went on to say, interestingly, we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph for one group or another. It isn't, because the 2010 Act gives transgender people protection not only against discrimination through their protected characteristics of gender reassignment, but against harassment in their acquired gender. So in other words, his task today was to stop the kind of jubilation, the kind of sense of victory versus defeat that we have seen played out outside the courts already this morning.
Exactly, because it is a victory. It is a victory for women's campaigners who say a woman is a woman at birth and you cannot change your sex just because you've got a gender recognition certificate. And so from that point of view, and I think that trans activists would say they have suffered a heavy defeat today. I mean, the background to it, as well as the board's case, the other case that really galvanised public opinion about it was the case of Isla Bryson, who was the man who was kind of on charges of raping two women, who suddenly says, I'm actually not a man, I'm Isla Bryson now, goes to court and is remanded, awaiting full trial in a women's prison.
In Scotland.
In Scotland. And people are saying, well, hang on, how can this person who is charged with raping two women be held in a women's prison? And I think that case kind of brought up some of the contradictions in what the Scottish government had tried to introduce, the SNP government under Nicola Sturgeon had brought in to effect, and it didn't enjoy public support. It never enjoyed public support. It was always an issue that affected comparatively few people, but was something that took up a huge amount of political airtime and debate.
So I think it's worth sort of unpacking exactly what the judge said about it not being a victory, because Lord Hodge was at pains to say, and he's right to say, that the Equality Act still does protect people who have changed their gender against discrimination. And it does. It's very, very, very clear about that. That is already in the law. But I think if you were a trans activist, what you might say is that what this does is effectively create a two-tier system, right? Because you can't discriminate. The judge is basically saying is you can't discriminate against a trans person because they're trans. That's true. But being trans, as a result of this ruling, does not legally give you the right to be treated as a woman who was born biologically female is in all circumstances. So even if you're a trans person, you've gone through the full process of gender reassignment, which is meant to affirm your identity in the law, you do not count as a woman, in this case, in one of the UK's most important anti-discrimination laws. So I think if you were trans, you would say, okay, we can't be discriminated against because we're trans, fine. But the whole point of the fact we're trans is to say that we are a woman or that we are men. And what the judgment does today is say, well, actually, you can't be treated as a woman or a man under all circumstances. And whatever you think about that, whether you think that's right or sensible or wrong or whatever you think, there will be people who do think that that embeds discrimination.
Yeah, curiously, it's even more complicated than that, because in the judgment, Lord Hodge went through these 9 different points to explain how he'd come to his decision. They'd come to their decision. And one of the points he makes is that if you don't take this position, you're creating a division between trans people who do have certificates and trans people who don't have certificates. And because you can't ever ask somebody if they have got a gender recognition reassignment certificate, then you are stuck in this place where, yeah, you've created another two-tier system within the trans community itself.
The other interesting thing about this, and I think, Lewis, you put your finger on something right at the top, which was about, what the Supreme Court has done today is give clarification to what Parliament meant in an act. Why hasn't Parliament done that?
Yes.
I mean, why hasn't Parliament been the ones to say, yeah, OK, guys, I'm sorry if you think there's confusion or, ambiguity in the legislation that we have passed. We're going to add a codicil or whatever it happens to be, or rewrite parts of the Act to make it clear what we meant. And the fact of the matter is the politicians didn't want to go near it, or a lot of politicians. And Keir Starmer in particular thought, oh my God, there is no good that can come of me grabbing that live rail and the huge, powerful emotions it evokes. And in fairness to Kemi Badenoch, she did want to grab it.
Yeah, and she has. I also think it's interesting that this is landing at a time when John Swinney is now the leader of the SNP. This was famously one of Nicola Sturgeon's sort of key policies, really. And Swinney came in after she left, after Hamza Youssef left, in a sort of calming of the waters position, didn't he? He's accepted this judgment, and my sense is he will be mightily happy that it has been taken off his plate, because this was, I think, it was very specific to Scotland, the case, because it was brought by Women for Scotland, one of the lobby groups there. And I think this now makes it easier for him to say, out of my hands, nothing to do with me, not political, this is the courts now.
I think, John, your point just now is absolutely right. It is actually pathetic that this ended up in the courts. And not just pathetic, I think it's going to be damaging. Because when something ends up in the courts, just whatever the court says, and again, Lord Hodge was he was very measured in what he said, and he was at pains to try and say, as we say, this shouldn't be treated as a victory or defeat. But there is something, by definition, about a court judgment, which is, if you'll forgive the use of the word in this context, binary. Right? It is a win or a loss, you're guilty or innocent. That's just how we think about court judgments. Parliament, at any point during this, could have issued an explanatory note to say what it meant when it said sex in the Equality Act of 2010. Or indeed, if it wanted to, it could update the legislation. And it chose not to do so, basically because most politicians found this question too difficult. And the net result, I think, and although in some ways, as I say, in some regards, this is quite a narrow judgment about what the Equality Act means, the thing about judgments like this, landmark judgments as they become, is that they can have a much wider kind of social and psychological and political effect, which goes beyond the kind of narrow strictures of the narrow question of jurisprudence and law that they were deciding upon. I think that given our media culture, particularly with regards to this trans debate, is so toxic, so often frothing at the mouth, so often others people in a really profound way, isn't measured whatsoever. My worry would be that this is going to give, rather than this being a moment of clarity and a moment of closure, that it basically gives license to people who have a pretty unpleasant agenda with many of these questions to use the judgment to basically say, aha, it's not just that the law or the judges have said what the Equality Act means. They have said that you as a trans person, you're not really a trans woman. You're not really a man. You're not really a woman in any circumstances. That it takes on a wider role in our social life, this judgment, beyond just the narrow element that it's been judging on.
It doesn't actually answer all the questions. It still leaves many, many questions. In other words, if you have to go back to biology to ascertain what you are, what then is the point of your gender reassignment recognition certificate? And you were raising the point of all the people who've changed their driving licences, all the people who might have changed their passports. This only applies to the Equalities Act of 2010. So on the one hand, you can say, no, this is just about, whether you can put yourself forward to sit on the board of a company in Scotland.
Or be in a women's only space.
Or compete in women's sports or go to a women's refuge and all the rest of it. But I guess the question is, what then does the gender certificate mean?
Exactly. I mean,
right. What does it actually mean?
Exactly. At its core, right, this ruling says biology always trumps identity and gender under this law. And I think the worry is, or the danger is that ruling is basically extrapolated and externalised onto all other elements of kind of
not
culture
legally,
and life.
but culturally.
Culturally, exactly. That basically it is used as a moment where we basically say, and the people who are basically hostile to trans rights basically say, look, the court said, you're not really a woman. You're not really a man. And there are lots of people who do not want that to happen and do just want to protect women's only spaces and women's only sports, which is totally fair enough. But I think that this could have a sort of maximalist effect that is unintended by the court, because this is what happens when things go to court in this way. If it had gone through Parliament, then you could have had MPs debating it. You could have tried to come to some sort of consensus position as best you can, with politicians explaining what they're doing. Instead, what has happened is it's gone through the courts. Most people weren't even aware this was happening. And lo and behold, the court drops out of nowhere and says, right, that's it. We've decided. And that has a life of its own, which I think could be dangerous, particularly given, as I say, our media culture is so toxic on this issue.
So someone I know who's been involved in the campaigning on this and kind of supported the Supreme Court judgment today said the next front in this is going to be the data bill, where it will become a big political test, because they want to argue that if the government makes it easy to change sex on passport and licences, it will mean people will still be able to present their incorrect sex and try to get into female spaces with their driver's licence or with their passport. So the question hasn't gone away. The Equalities Act doesn't cover it, but there will be kind of future legislation where, these campaigners say, right, well, we've got this from the Equalities Act, now we need to make it somewhere else as well. And so I don't think this, as we've been saying, this debate has not gone away yet.
Wait, let's just kind of litigate that one. That's really interesting. So if you had let's imagine you might have gone for gender reassignment surgery because you then wanted to be able to get the certificate that confirmed that you were now of a different sex, right? If that certificate does not then allow you to say you are of a different sex, what does that mean about everything that you have done up to that point, maybe to get the certificate? And if no one can ever ask you if you have the certificate or you don't have the certificate, then presumably, yeah, you can still put whatever you want on a driving licence. You can still put whatever you want on a
I suspect
form.
This will be the next front.
Right.
Yes.
In all of this. Can I just have an aside that, what I've hated about this whole debate throughout is the way it's been used as a culture war issue, pretty largely on the... I mean, look, there are women's groups and the J.K. Rowlings of this world who argue about, from a feminist perspective, but it's also been seized on by the populist right, and they are now kind of claiming a huge victory on this today. I go back to the judgment that has come from the Supreme Court justices. I just go back to kind of 2016 when the Daily Mail published that headline, Enemies of the People, and the three judges who'd ruled that about Parliament would have to approve the Brexit bill or whatever it was, and the Brexit campaigners were furious about that. I wonder whether the Daily Mail will now publish a front page saying friends of the people to these justices, or are they just justices in 2016 doing their job and interpreting the law, and today doing their job, which is, thank God, what our independent judicial system does.
Yeah, all those critics of judicial activism weirdly silent.
No,
it's funny
nothing
that.
to be.
It's almost
not
as
to be
if
seen.
It's almost as if people who don't like judicial decisions only really dislike them when they disagree with what they think.
When they're on the losing side.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we should say as well, like, sometimes there's a sort of, because everyone has become so, I mean, we're very guilty of this, but like American politics, we sort of treat some of these Supreme Court decisions as if they're final, like they would be in the US Supreme Court. Ultimately the US Supreme Court has the last word. In our system,
sort of.
Well, that's being questioned right now.
True. Fair. Well, historically, up to now, but it has the last word. In our system, Parliament has the last word. So if Parliament wanted to overturn this judgment, they could do so tomorrow.
Yeah,
it would be up to them. If MPs pass fresh legislation, amend the Equality Act. Now, that is, I think, very unlikely, given the fact that, as we say, Parliament has been very sort of pusillanimous in all of this and wanted to kind of push this as far away as possible. But it's not the last word. This is part of an ongoing cultural conversation and discussion.
I would also say, I'm not sure it's entirely right to say this is just a cultural issue of the far right, of the populist right, because I think it's...
I qualified it and said about, there are a lot of, feminists who feel very strongly and understandably that there have to be women-only safe spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, as with so many of the things that have sort of led to populism, it's something that's happened very quickly, that's left a lot of people very confused and feeling very left out. And I'm talking about parents, I'm talking about teachers, I'm talking about, people who want to be the most supportive they can to vulnerable kids in the best way that they can, but actually don't understand the speed of which this whole debate sort of changed so quickly in about 10 years. And I think in a way that has opened the space. It did open the space for for populism. It did open the space for Trump to make this absolutely central to his campaign. You remember the campaign slogan that they all said did more damage to Kamala than anything else, which was, she's all about they, them, Trump works for you. And it just cut through everything, which was the confusion, the, in quotation marks, the woke. But it was also people who just felt, I don't understand what's going on now. I feel left behind. I feel like society's moved on to a place too rapidly that has shut me out. And I think that, as we know, has been such a sort of strong part of, the Trump victory.
I got so fed up with the endless questions of, so, do you know what a woman is? What is a woman? Maybe that bit of kind of performative kind of
that was all
politics will go. We've had that whole, I don't know, kind of, so what is a woman? What is a man? Can a woman have a penis? All of that. Hopefully that now goes because we have got the Supreme Court definition that you are the sex that you're born with.
The thing is, I wouldn't count on it because I think that, as I say, look, I think that a lot of the media on this question is pretty venal, actually. I mean, the amount of attention that this particular, considering it's 1% of the population, and look, and I completely understand and sympathetic to it, and often feel sort of ill-qualified to kind of express any particular opinion on it because I'm directly affected by it. But nonetheless, I understand why many women feel really passionate about it. I do sometimes feel there is just an element, though, there's a bit of like the element with the immigration debate, where we basically sort of alight upon a group of people and we seem to pretend that all of our problems within society are down to that group of people. I mean, if we think about the problem women face, let's talk about like sexual violence. We're talking about access to women-only spaces. We know who perpetrates the vast majority of female violence. It's men. It's men who are born as men, and it's men in, the streets, or it's in the family home.
That is the argument. So it's not that women are saying it's trans women. They're saying it's bad actors who present as trans women. I think it's a very different thing to understand.
Safe spaces,
if women are scared of men, they're scared of men, and they just don't differentiate between the men they are scared of.
But if women's only spaces, if a man intends to rape someone, then they're unlikely to pretend to be a trans man or present themselves in that situation.
No, that's how you get access. I mean, that's the argument. I'm not saying, I'm just trying to break down the idea that nobody thinks that the trans community are violent. People think that they use the trans identity as a cover for predatory men who wish women ill. That's what it's about.
But the amount of attention which is applied to this extremely, whenever anyone asks for evidence of this, and sometimes there is evidence, but we know it is a tiny, tiny number of very often very, very obscure cases, as opposed to, let's think about the sort of actual problems that afflict women generally in our society and economy. It is unequal pay. It is sexual violence in the home. It is issues around childcare. All of this stuff ends up getting completely squeezed and dedicated to a tiny, tiny part of the population. And actually, as we know from the polling, an issue which, in terms of the vast majority of people and the vast majority of women, they think about not at all. The level of social capital. This is such. I'm not saying it's only just a media debate, but my word is it frothed up and made into a frenzy and increased and amplified out of all proportion by the media, which is obsessed with it. Because actually, in terms of the polling, we can see there is actually a very, very mainstream position held by the vast, vast majority of people, men and women, across the country, which is often, they don't agree with the idea of giving puberty blockers to children. They don't agree with men competing in women's sports and so on. But they do want to see a straightforward and compassionate position arrived towards trans people, which is often not represented in the media because there is a complete othering of them as a community.
I just want to talk to the politics of how difficult this was. You raised the question of, every interview asking what a woman is, and nobody can ever answer, and whether it was performative. I've just found a message from someone who worked closely with Keir Starmer, and I was asking him about Labour's position on this. And this person said, sorry, in with Keir at the moment, but I think, so-and-so set it out well. We just need to have an answer to, does a woman have a penis type question that you can give clearly. And I said, so what is the answer to that now? 12:06. It took him another 4 minutes to come back.
He may have been very busy.
He may have been busy.
No, he had a cup of tea.
My sense is that actually we haven't answered it.
No, I don't
we haven't solved it. If Keir Starmer's in that chair now and I said, does a woman have a penis? I'm not sure that we have resolved it, because all this judgment does is talk about a very slim part of the 2010 Act. And so we may just find, we think we've got clarity, we try and cling on to the clarity, but it's a bit of a chimera.
That's right.
Look, we have been speaking about this for the last 15, 20 minutes. We spoke to our colleagues at LBC today about, did the phones light up this morning after the Supreme Court judgment, with people wanting to ring in, taking trenchant positions on both sides? No, they didn't.
Maybe this afternoon.
Maybe this afternoon it will change. But again, it underlines the extent to which, as Lewis was saying, this is something that the media obsesses about and most people in their daily lives do not. We'll be back after the break. Before we go, in case you've missed it, Donald Trump has deported quite a lot of people who are alleged gang members to a supermax prison in El Salvador, where people are locked up for 23.5 hours a day and given half an hour's exercise, including someone who should never have been sent. So, are the White House climbing down, apologising, backing off? No, this is Caroline Leavitt, Donald Trump's spokesperson.
Abrego Garcia was a foreign terrorist. He is an MS-13 gang member. He was engaged in human trafficking. He illegally came into our country. And so deporting him back to El Salvador was always going to be the end result. There is never going to be a world in which this is an individual who's going to live a peaceful life in Maryland, because he is a foreign terrorist and a MS-13 gang member. Not only have we confirmed that, President Bukele yesterday in the Oval Office confirmed that as well. So he went back to his home country, where he will face consequences for his gang affiliation and his engagement in human trafficking. I'm not sure what is so difficult about this for everyone in the media to understand. And it's appalling, truly appalling, that there has been so much time covering this alleged human trafficker and this gang member, MS-13 gang.
Okay. Let's just see if that checks out, shall we? Because Abrego Garcia, who was born in El Salvador, came to the US in 2011 when he was 16, married an American. They have American children and has been steadily employed. There is no criminal record. There is no criminal record. Lest we forget, he actually has fewer convictions than the President of the United States. And he was sent on March the 15th to an El Salvadorian prison, and the administration, Trump's administration, admitted shortly afterwards that it had been an administrative error. So you circle that one then. Is she saying, is Caroline Leavitt saying we made a mistake, or is she saying we did make a mistake but it doesn't really matter because we're going to decide he was a terrorist anyway? And there is now a wrangle going on between the Supreme Court, who have stated quite clearly that Trump's administration have to facilitate his return to the US, and Trump, who's kind of saying, he's not saying he won't, he's just kind of like not doing it. Oh yeah, I'd love to comply, but it's a bit tricky. It all depends on Bukele. What, this massive giant of an El Salvadorian president that he can't control suddenly? I don't think so.
I think this goes to the heart of what something we've talked about on the show quite a lot, which is becoming more manifest and a bigger problem with every passing week, which is that Trump, one of the only checks on his power is the courts. There is clearly an almighty showdown coming with the Supreme Court at some point, and he is making it very clear, not least because there is no effective congressional check on his power. Congress has basically absented itself. If any of you, I'm sure lots of you do, read the American media, follow the American media. When was the last time you heard the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader say anything in particular of any particular importance? There's virtually no really big significant legislation going through it. The courts are basically the only thing which is trying to keep Trump on the right side of the law, and he is exposing even their impotence, because in any constitutional system, no matter how profound it is, ultimately, if an executive decides it wants to ignore the court, all the court can do is keep insisting that they do what they want them to do. And right now, Trump is pushing the theory and limit to its limits that he doesn't have to.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the US administration needs to be making efforts to get him back because he had protected status in the US, was there legally.
With the 6-3 Conservative majority on that court, by the way.
Yeah, voting unanimously. And the administration is saying, yeah, screw that.
Not screw that, but
maybe. We'll see.
So look, we are going to be asking on the News Agents USA whether we are now essentially at that point of constitutional crisis. If the executive, if the president is not listening to his Supreme Court, What happens next?
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.